Hey, good morning, everybody. I think we're going to get started. I'll just ask our panelists to join us. Turn on their videos. Great. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. And I'd also just like to say thanks in advance to the Endangered Wildlife Trust's comms and marketing and IT team who are doing such a good job in producing these wild chats over the past few weeks. I'm sure many of the people listening today are regulars and have learned a lot about what the EWT gets up to. Today's Wild Chat's going to be slightly different from previous ones. We'll be having a panel discussion and then opening this up to questions from you, the audience. Today's topic is also one that's very current. As everybody knows, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the potential for zoonotic diseases to have significant global impacts on human health and socioeconomic stability. And it's made people very aware that there are threats to both human health and biodiversity that are posed by illegal wildlife trade. When wild animals are moved out of their natural habitats and brought into contact with people, often under very stressful conditions, with little regard to their health or to safety and hygiene standards, there is an increased risk of disease between people and animals. So to shed some light on this really important topic, and it's a very topical one, I'm really delighted to present two speakers from the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Wildlife and Trade Programme. They each bring slightly different perspectives on the issue, because it's not just about illegal trade, but also the importance of the wildlife economy for biodiversity, conservation and job creation and rural livelihoods, especially in this part of the world. So the first panelist that I'd introduce is Annie DuPre-Reynolds. She is the program manager for the Endangered Wildlife Trust's Wildlife and Trade Programme. And Annie has a master's in global policy studies, and she's lived in South Africa for the past 5 years, during which time she's worked on issues related to international organized crime, international relations, and policy development. And she joined the EWT at the end of last year. Annie's also a registered field guide and a backup trails guide with a passion for wildlife and conservation. And I think she's got one of the longest bird lists during the COVID lockdown, just on the back of her garden. So very passionate naturalist and wildlife lover. The second panelist is Dr. Andrew Taylor, who's a senior wildlife trade officer in the Wildlife and Trade Programme. He has a PhD in zoology and veterinary tropical diseases, and he's done a lot of work on both legal and illegal wildlife trade issues. He's been a lead author on a number of significant trade-related research projects, including the first ever national assessment of wildlife ranching in South Africa. So to kick things off, I'm going to ask you, Annie, why has the EWT been paying attention to this issue, and why do we think it's important?
Thanks, Harriet, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I see we have people from not just South Africa, but around the world, actually. So, you know, I think the rise of COVID-19 has affected everyone's lives in lots of different ways. I mean, the fact that we're all here together on a webinar shows that people are working from home, they're at home and they're trying to learn about what's going on around the world. And in a sense, this is bringing us together in a way that nothing else really has. And I think it highlights the opportunity for us to talk about wildlife trade, in particular illegal wildlife trade, and the implications for disease spread and what governments and organizations and individuals really need to be doing. From our side at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, in particular in the Wildlife and Trade Programme, we've been looking at this specific situation since its rise in January in China. And, you know, the world is in its current situation, no doubt, because of the spillover of this virus from wildlife to humans. And it really highlights the fact that we need to be developing ways to address the possible rise and spillover of disease. And the fact that illegal wildlife trade is not just a conservation issue, but is actually a public health issue. And from the wildlife and trade side, you know, we've also spoken about how illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime is actually a massive global organized crime that needs to be addressed as such as well, not just a conservation issue. So I think, you know, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is not the first zoonotic disease that we're seeing in the world. and it's probably not going to be the last one. So even as things start to slowly shift out of lockdown and we start to see changes and people slowly going back to normal life, we need to not lose momentum on these conversations, you know. So I think having everyone here discussing this, I'm sure we've all been overwhelmed by information over the last couple of months. Some of it is not necessarily true information, and I think there's been a lot of confusion and questions, and that's where we're coming in, hopefully, to answer some of those in what time we have. But you know, we're overwhelmed by information now, and what's likely to happen is that people might forget about this once we get back to normal life, and we want to encourage that to not be the case, that we keep these conversations going and we use this time to, you know, keep up the pressure on governments and organizations to really make changes that can protect animals and people.
Great, thank you, Annie. I think I mean, you raised some really important points, but it's not just about the illegal wildlife trade in terms of the threats of pandemics and zoonoses. And perhaps, Angie, I can move over to you just to talk a little bit about the legal wildlife sector and what that means and how that looks in Southern Africa.
Yeah, thanks very much, Harriet. Morning, everyone. So the legal wildlife sector is a part or one part of what we call the biodiversity economy, which includes things like bioprospecting, the marine and coastal tourism sector, but also the wildlife economy itself. And because South Africa is a megadiverse country, we have incredible biodiversity resources at our fingertips. And so this creates a huge opportunity for us to use our biological resources in a way that can stimulate and help and sustain livelihoods in the country. And so the aim of the biodiversity economy is to grow the economy, to create jobs and sustain jobs, but also to do so in a way that is sustainable to the environment. The biodiversity economy is regulated by the government, and it's also partially operationalized by the government, so national parks and provincial parks. But also a large aspect of the wildlife sector is operationalized by the private sector. So, and the private sector includes consumptive and non-consumptive uses, hunting, live trade in animals, and there's also a big section on ecotourism and non-consumptive ecotourism. And it's important to remember that when you combine all of these sectors, they make significant contributions to the economy. So we don't know exactly the scale, but we know that it contributes more than 10 billion Rand towards revenues. It creates 70 to 100,000, or approximately that many permanent jobs. There's potential for game meat, for food security, and also, of course, for biodiversity conservation.
Great, just to stay on that for a moment. When you say also to biodiversity conservation, I mean, in your opinion, what are the big biodiversity wins that emerge from this sector?
So, well, what we know for sure is that however large it is in terms of area, a large part of the area that is covered by the wildlife sector can be considered space that is used for conservation. So one really important way of conserving wildlife and conserving biodiversity is to actually protect space. And the wildlife ranching sector does that. So we don't really know the degree or the extent to which it conserves biodiversity, and there's probably a continuum. So there will be some places that don't conserve very much biodiversity at all, and there'll be some that do it to the same extent as Kruger National Park. And many private properties will be somewhere in between.
So when we're thinking about that, I mean, that's almost the antithesis of what we're thinking about when we think about markets that are very constrained and animals in really tough conditions. Moving on to that, Annie, I mean, with this coronavirus outbreak and the pandemic, and China, the world is thinking about this and China's ban of wildlife trade. And would you like to perhaps talk a bit about what their ban actually meant?
Sure, yeah, and I think that also gets back to misinformation that I think gets spread around. You know, when we hear ban on trade, it sounds very comprehensive and all-encompassing. And in fact, you know, that's not something that we would encourage in any case. We don't encourage blanket bans on wildlife trade across the board. You know, from January, when the Chinese government first started talking about a temporary ban on wildlife markets, we saw some positives coming out of that, because it seemed like what the government was going to be doing was, and has done, is really to crack down on wildlife markets where, in particular, there has been laundering of illegally sourced products. In February, when the Chinese government announced the permanent ban on consumption of terrestrial wildlife, that was also conflated and confused a bit in the media. So essentially what has happened is that the Chinese government has placed a ban on the consumption of terrestrial wildlife. And so that would be, animals that are used, or wildlife that is used for food purposes. That does not cover medicine. It doesn't cover animals that are used for clothing or decoration. It doesn't cover experiments. It doesn't cover pets and that kind of thing. So, there are still loopholes that I think do need to be addressed, because the problem is that, even in some of these wet markets and wildlife markets where animals might be traded for those other reasons, there's possibility of laundering of species. But it is a bit more specific as far as the ban goes than what has been shared publicly quite often.
Yeah, I think that what you've just explained is probably news to quite a few people on this group. When we talk about bans of wildlife trade, we think of these blanket things, and it really wasn't that. So, so thanks for clarifying that, Annie. Over to you, Andrew. I mean, do you think that all wildlife trade should be banned to try and overcome, these kinds of events in the future?
So no, definitely not. And so Annie touched on it briefly when she was talking just now. And I think to start with, we need to be a little bit cautious about sort of terminology here. So we have different types of wildlife trade. We have illegal trade, and we have legal trade, and we also have sustainable trade and unsustainable trade. So, and yeah, we need to make sure that we don't lump them all in the same category. So yeah, and make sure we don't consider them all the same. But we should do everything we possibly can to stop or reduce the negative impacts of illegal trade and unsustainable trade. And now, of course, we know that we also need to take into account potential zoonotic diseases, which have caused havoc in the last few months. But we also need to allow for the sustainable use of wildlife and using trade mechanisms that are legal and fully sustainable, because of the livelihoods that are supported by it. And this is both commercially and sort of at a sustainable level. We shouldn't just think that subsistence type trade is okay, because subsistence trade itself can also be very damaging if it's not regulated. So, but we need to allow for responsible, sustainable trade, whether it's commercial or subsistence.
Excellent, thank you, Andy. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're highlighting is that there's a very complex set of circumstances that this trade operates under, and that it's not one silver bullet that's going to fix anything. I see that. Yeah, sure.
Can I just respond to that as well? Just to say, something that I think we haven't necessarily been able to highlight yet is that we've made a couple of position statements or a couple of media statements on this at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and as you'll know, recently we published a perspective on illegal wildlife trade and disease. And in that, we have a number of recommendations which are directed to both governments and organizations and even individuals. That touches a bit on what Andrew was saying, differentiating between those different kinds of trade and looking at bolstering existing bans on illegal wildlife trade, but also bolstering the ability of regulation of legal trade and supporting sustainable trade, as Andrew says. So for those who are on here who would be interested, and we can share this link with you, the perspective I think is a pretty good summary of the endangered wildlife trade's position on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. I might even ask you to expand a little bit more on that a little bit later. But let's see, we've got some questions coming in from the audience here. And so I'll stop hogging the floor, and perhaps I can ask you about this one, Andrew, and it's from Neil Fitt from Botswana. And he's just asking about the issue of South Africa domesticating a large number of wildlife species and then trading in them, and so farming wildlife. And I think we're all aware, there's been some recent legislative changes that have really sort of underscored this issue for us over the last 18 months or so. The Animal Improvement Act being one, and obviously the Meat Safety Act, which is under review at the moment. Do you have any perspective on this and that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. So I think to start, we don't really know yet the extent to which the Animal Improvement Act, which you mentioned, will sort of affect the wildlife sector, the private wildlife sector. There are certainly concerns amongst conservationists because what we think could potentially happen under the Animal Improvement Act would be that this could potentially lead to what we would consider domestication of wildlife. So it would be real farming of wildlife under pretty captive conditions. And in the long term, that could lead to domestication. And of course, the loss of a wildness in these species. And the potential negative impacts of that there could be impacts on tourism, because tourists come to see, most tourists come to see wild animals. And if they were to know that this animal is a farmed animal and almost domesticated, not wild, would they want to come and see it? And of course, that would also apply to foreign hunters. Now, I know hunting is not to everyone's taste, but it does generate a lot of income and jobs for the country. And it conserves space as well. The use of hunting conserves space. So there would be a potential impact on trophy hunters, because who would want to come and hunt a domesticated or a farmed stable, for example. But I think we also need to be cautious. We don't yet know really the extent to which this will happen. And I'm not also sure the extent to which the wildlife sector itself is in support of these changes. But definitely it would cause problems. It could potentially cause problems, because then how would we differentiate between what is genuinely a wild animal and what is now a farmed animal? But I know that there is concern amongst the conservation community and also amongst some of the wildlife sector as well. But this is something that is not yet resolved.
Yeah, so still quite a lot of uncertainty around that. And I know that I've seen some recent articles about people getting very concerned because things like rhino have been listed on the Meat Safety Act. And people have sort of taken that to be something that the government is now supporting the use of rhino meat. But I think that's taking that a little bit too, probably taking the interpretation of what this means a little bit too far. It's not sort of Andy, any comments on that?
Yeah, again, I mean, it is, the rhinos have been placed on there, and so it potentially leaves it open for that issue, but it seems extremely unlikely. I mean, people would only harvest meat from species that don't have particularly high value, so it primarily come from things like impala, springbok, blue wildebeest. The idea of hunting a rhino for its meat it would be economically a terrible idea. Although, of course, the country does allow trophy hunting of white rhinos, and up to 5 black rhinos at the moment. And in those circumstances, when that happens, the meat is generally used. But to do it commercially, I would very, very unlikely.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So over to you, Annie. Here's a question I think that you might like to answer. Karine says, I'm a French new field guide for Gaza, and I want to know how I can find a job to help to prevent all of this. Is there a way of helping the cause when choosing work?
I love that question. I mean, not just because I'm a FAGASA field guide as well, but because it really gets to the root of a lot of how we protect wildlife in South Africa and around the world. I mean, it's people on the ground, right? South Africa is currently in a very challenging situation, in particular because we have fewer people. Tourism has, stagnated, so fewer people are on the ground in reserves, which means fewer eyes, which means, we have greater risks around poaching. In my conversations with guys who manage reserves and work in security reserves, they've had to become very creative and, they're trying to stay one step ahead all the time of poachers, whether it's for rhino horn, for example, or for another product. I think there's also a question people have been asking about bushmeat poaching, that the rise in bushmeat poaching has also been a concern. I think if you want to be a FAGASA guide and guide people every day in the bush and teach them about wildlife and the value of wildlife, across the board, the importance of conservation and biodiversity, that alone is huge in this, and should never belittle just that. I mean, to come over here and be a guide is a great thing. I know lots of people who are from places besides South Africa. I mean, for example, me, I'm obviously not from here, and you can make a massive contribution that way. And there's other organizations that hire guides to do, to take volunteers around and also do education. I think it's a great way to start in this industry.
It's going to definitely be interesting to see how that shapes up in the near future, sort of medium term, in terms of the impacts on tourism as a result of all these lockdowns and constrained movements. Andrew, a question for you from DuPre-Reynolds. I hope I've said that properly. What are the research gaps in biopiracy and other illegal and legal trade of wildlife? Are there particular research gaps that we need to try and address?
Sorry, in biopiracy and what?
And other illegal and legal trade of wildlife. So I suppose it's quite a broad question.
Yeah, so I
mean, what do we need to know?
So, okay, so one really critical question for a topic that sort of everyone is kind of familiar with and many people have opinions on would be whether we can trade in a product of a threatened species. So for example, elephant ivory, rhino horn. And so this is a very polarized debate. People sit on both sides and argue, and they, there are good arguments for both sides. I think if you're sort of objective about it, you can see that there are good arguments for both sides. But the problem is there's a lot of information that we really are lacking to help us make a good decision on whether we should trade. And of course, it would differ per species. So you can't, if you said, yes, we can trade in a product of, let's say, rhino horn, and I'm not saying that we can do that. I'm saying if hypothetically, that wouldn't necessarily apply to elephant ivory, and it certainly wouldn't apply to pangolin scales. But in terms of knowledge gaps, we would need to understand the illegal side of the trade in these products to a much greater extent. So we would need to understand all the nitty-gritty details of sort of organized crime and how they sort of organize themselves and how they transfer and traffic products around the world. We would need to understand about sort of the financial mechanisms that they use. We need to have more information about that. We would need to understand how organized crime would respond to illegal trade. So if we decided, should we legalize a trade in a specific product, we would need to understand how the markets would respond to it, the illegal side as well. We would need to understand how the potential consumers would respond. Would we suddenly see a very large increase in consumers wanting a product because now they see that it's actually allowed? So there's all kinds of information that we are lacking for determining whether we could have legal trade. In terms of biopiracy, I'm afraid I'm not really sure. If you can give me an example, if the guy can maybe give me an example, I could maybe answer it, but I'm not really sure what that is.
Okay, well, Annie, perhaps do you have?
No, I don't know I also don't know what biopiracy is. It sounds quite interesting. But I was just going to also add to that by nature, illegal wildlife trade is conducted covertly. So there's a lot of information that we don't have, right? And there's great organizations that are doing specific research on, collecting data on seizures. We, for example, are collecting data on seizures, traffic. There's a couple of other organizations that regularly collect this information, and even more that I think are rising. And I think this gets back to the point that I had at the beginning of turning this not just from being a conservation issue, but also being an organized crime issue. Yeah. And I think that conversation has been happening more and more. I mean, I participated in a workshop at one of the big banks here not long ago on looking at wildlife crime through illicit money laundering and following the money. And I think there are lots of ways that we can start to exploit those kinds of avenues to really understand what's going on with illegal wildlife trade. But even with seizure data, that doesn't necessarily give us the whole picture about what's going on, right? I mean, you only get the seizure data if you seize the product. Yeah. And obviously there are things that are making it from destination, from source to destination. And I think another thing I meant to highlight in the beginning is that this is particularly important to South Africa because we are often highlighted as being the source for a lot of this illegally trafficked wildlife product going out of Southern Africa and heading most time to Asia, although it also goes to other places. But
great.
Could I just, okay, I've just Googled, I did kind of know it, but I'd forgotten. So biopiracy, my understanding of it is, so it would apply very much to bioprospecting. So we'd be taking local indigenous knowledge of potential uses for plants and animals for medicinal properties and things, cosmetic stuff, and taking that knowledge and then taking a product from, say, from South Africa and then going and producing your own products and selling it in another country without paying the people who have the knowledge, paying the country itself. So you're effectively stealing from the country and from the local people who have the knowledge. That how you deal with that has to be dealt with legally. I think I don't know very much about bioprospecting, but that needs to be dealt with legally, and I'm pretty sure that the government is putting things in place to deal with this, because bioprospecting as part of the biodiversity economy is a really big part of that economy, and the government needs to make that work well, and so preventing biopiracy would be critical.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, so as in developing South Africa's wildlife economy, biodiversity economy, bioprospecting was one of the 3 key elements that were considered for it. And I know that the Nagoya Protocol on bioprospecting means that there are international agreements that oversee how I suppose the benefits from the prospecting do return to the countries of origin and to the people who have that knowledge. So I think, we're not going to have too much longer to be able to talk, probably another 5 or 10 minutes. Just to remind everybody, please pop your questions into the Q&A box if you have them. Annie, I just want to ask you, there's a question here from Alistair. What is the EWT's position on reforming CITES so that it is more efficient and can better control trade?
I was actually wondering I think, CITES is an excellent tool for looking at sustainable trade in wild species of plants and animals. One of the things that we talk about...
Can I interrupt you? Just CITES, so that's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora.
Exactly.
And for those of you, it's, the conservation literature is full of lots of acronyms. So, but because that's such a long one, we all just say CITES. So sorry, Annie, go ahead.
No, I think it's a good question. I think it really gets to political will within countries because, countries are partners of CITES and therefore they are charged with implementing the regulations that CITES outlines, right? So in South Africa, South Africa is a partner. We have both management and scientific counsel on this. And, I think there probably are gaps. And one of the things that we address in our perspective paper is the need for greater focus on welfare around trade in species. So I think that's something that definitely should be addressed more. There was a press release a few years ago between CITES and the World Organization for Animal Health, which mentioned increasing focus on welfare in trade. I think there are going to be more conversations in CITES about how we can develop early warning systems. What sort of things need to be changed and bolstered. But it's definitely a political will question of enhancing and acting on those regulations within countries where trade exists.
So I think that's exactly the point, and why we're making the distinction that this is not just about illegal wildlife trade, because even legal trade can have animals that are in conditions that really lend themselves to outbreaks of disease.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you're right. I mean, CITES designates Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3 species, but you wouldn't necessarily have a sustainable population of horseshoe bats, for example, listed as an Appendix 1 species because of the possibility of disease transfer. And so those kinds of things do probably need to be considered more fully.
Yeah.
I think, can I just add to that, to your
Yeah.
points as well? So it also depends on terms of which direction that question is coming from. So there are perceptions that CITES doesn't do enough to ban wildlife trade, and there, on the other side of the coin, there are perceptions that CITES is doing too much and maybe implementing bans when they shouldn't be. And so it's important to remember that CITES, when it was first set up, it wasn't, the plan of CITES wasn't to say we are just going to ban wildlife trade across the board. It was to find ways or use bans or use regulations to reduce the negative impacts of trade. And so there potentially CITES could work on ways of being more effective in doing that. And I think from one side of the sort of debate, it would be, and this is maybe a personal perspective, but I think it would be EWT's perspective as well. It would be good, it's really important to be evidence-based. And so decisions from CITES should be based on evidence and science, and not just people's opinions. From whichever side those opinions come.
And I think it's also, like with any international convention, you know, the decisions that are made through international negotiation. And so it's not like CITES is a separate entity from its members. And it is quite a lumbering beast. So it's not always easy to make changes quickly, but certainly we should be working to try and improve things. So Andy, over to you. Just a question from Valerie. She says, many countries in Africa and even in South America are beginning to face a food crisis due to the effects of the coronavirus. Do you think that there's a risk of an increasing use of bushmeat, so more poaching, hunting, and even wildlife trade?
Yes, theoretically, definitely, there's a chance of that. And I would say, I don't have any personal evidence of it. For example, one person on the western boundary in Kruger has told me that their poaching situation is very quiet at the moment, but that's more relating to the rhino side of things. I'm not aware of sort of evidence or reports of increased. I've heard people talk about it. I don't know where their evidence came from and whether they were talking from experience, but it seems extremely likely that if you start taking away people's livelihoods, start taking away their incomes, they can't buy their own food, or they don't have enough to buy food, they're going to start searching for alternatives. And of course, wild meat from places where they're not likely to get caught is going to be a very good source of that. And of course, it really is a huge source. I mean, bushmeat poaching is huge. I mean, you know, we mostly think of it, we tend to mostly think of it in terms of the sort of forest areas of Africa, but it's also really significant in savanna parts of Africa, and I'd imagine in South America too, and in Southeast Asia. But yes, it's something that has to be considered. And also adding on to that, the impacts of the loss of tourism income are going to have major impacts on people's ability to feed themselves and their families, because a lot of people generate their income through tourism as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Annie. It looks like you need to say something as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I think this is what we call a wicked problem in policy, right? Because it expands far beyond even just that question. You know, it's not just with the reduction in work due to lockdown that people are now needing more food sources, and therefore they might also encroach on natural habitats and protected areas for bushmeat. But we also see a knock-on effect of, because of the lockdown on transport of wild species abroad. For example, in the Western Cape, apparently the abalone poachers, stopped harvesting for a while because they weren't able to ship their abalone over to China, where there were buyers. And so as a result, there was a rise in crime because people who had previously relied on that income were turning to other mechanisms to try and make an income, right? And I think that this also connects to, Valerie asked another question around how complicated communication can be when you're talking to people who rely on wildlife for livelihoods or for sustenance, whether it's sustainable or unsustainable. And that also, I would just recommend looking at our perspective paper, because we do highlight the need for both positive reinforcement buyer campaigns and buyer beware campaigns that work to to speak to communities to show what you should and shouldn't be purchasing and what is, sustainable and what isn't sustainable. And it is, I mean, it's an extremely complicated thing. And those kinds of decisions cannot be made, in isolation from those communities. So I think that's something we also really wanted to highlight.
Great, thank you, Annie. And so I've got a question for you. Do you think that the pangolin really caused this crisis? How much of an involvement? We're talking about misinformation, and what's your perspective on that?
Sorry, I'm laughing because I get that question from family all the time. And honestly, I've spoken to so many people back in the States who have to Google what a pangolin is because they've never seen it before. And then, the reaction of it looks like an armadillo or a funny anteater. So there is a lot of misinformation out there. I think that in some senses it's been highlighted as, maybe that's a positive thing because people are going to stop trying to poach pangolin because they think that they might carry the coronavirus. And I think first and foremost, if we don't encroach on wildlife and continue to push into natural spaces and bring wildlife into situations in, illegal wildlife trade, for example, where they're under high stress situations and the possibility of disease transmission is heightened, we don't have any fear of wildlife. There's no reason to be afraid of disease transmission from these animals, right? As long as you view them from a safe distance, you're safe. Respect and all of that. But there hasn't been no conclusive evidence to point to the pangolin as the intermediary species. The way the coronavirus works, and I'm not a disease specialist, but from everything that I've read, coronaviruses originate in wildlife or in animals, and then can evolve through some means to transmit between one animal, possibly to another, and then into human beings. This is the case with SARS, this was the case with MERS, and this is likely the case with the current coronavirus. So while fingers have been pointed at the pangolin, there has been no conclusive evidence. So no, we do not say, watch out for pangolin, they're going to give you coronavirus. That's definitely not the case.
Okay. Great, thank you. I see we have quite a number of questions still here, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. And we'll make an effort to make sure we get back to everybody on these. But I think that this question from Mel Tripp, which I think is really the crux of the thing here, and I'm going to ask you both to respond, perhaps Andrew first and then Annie to close. So will this recent zoonotic virus really make any change in wildlife trade or markets? Will governments implement new regulations and policing and policies, and is there a will? What are your thoughts on that? And maybe Andrew, I can let you kick off.
I have no idea. Yeah, I think, Annie would definitely be able to give a better answer than this. I know she's been reading up on this quite a lot, much more than I have. I'm afraid I don't know. As I think Annie will be able to say, there were some moves to shut down some of these so-called wet markets in China. And now there's moves to reverse those closures. So I'm afraid I don't know. I think in terms of African markets, so bushmeat sales in Africa, and a lot of them would just take place up in sort of Central and West Africa. Wildlife forms a very significant source of protein for many, many millions and millions of, probably hundreds of millions of people in those very large forested areas, and even in the savanna areas. And so to think that we can take away that source of protein would be crazy. And if we tried to do it through regulation, it would almost certainly go on. Not that it's all legal, but if we tried to ban it all and stop it, a lot of it would go underground. So it wouldn't stop. And we wouldn't be able to justify stopping people's meat sources, but we need to find ways to make it more sustainable while also trying to reduce the chances of disease. But also keep in mind that COVID-19 itself has it's now in a human population, but it's not going to pop out in a market in the Congo somewhere, because it would come out as a different disease. So we'd have to be expecting different kinds of diseases from other places. But let Annie give a better answer.
No, I think, oh yeah.
Before you do, I've just been told that I'm allowed to continue until 12. So because we started slightly late. So I think we'll keep on with this question, and then I'll have a look through and see what else we can answer. Okay, Annie.
So this brings up something else for me, which I think is really important, that we differentiate between people who consume wildlife for survival or as a protein source. And, you know, we've spoken about bushmeat, we've spoken about, there's wildlife trade in species in China, for example, where people have been consuming things like frogs and, you know, squirrels and rabbits and a whole bunch of different species that are used for an actual food source, a protein source, versus a exotic dish, which is where you see things like pangolin meat coming in. And there is apparently a huge lobbying body behind the more